Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Imperial War Museum London, where we're very, very happy to once again be hosting the movement for abolition of war. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Christine Bloor. Christine is the Vice President of the Movement for the Abolition of War, and a former General Secretary of the National Union of Teachers. Thank you very much.
So, colleagues, thank you very much. As John said in his introduction, I am the former General Secretary of the National Union of Teachers, but I am also currently the International Secretary of the National Union of Teachers, a job that I'm very delighted to hold on a strictly part-time basis. And what that means is that, like our speaker, whom I'm going to introduce shortly, I also work at the international level of the trade union movement. A movement which is very close to my heart and I'm sure to our speakers, and I hope to very many of you. So the question is, why should the trade union movement be interested in the achievement of the abolition of war? Well, quite simply because it's the right thing to do. But there are some other contributory reasons, and they are, for example, that our own members of the trade union movement globally, often find themselves on the front line when there are wars. They find themselves on the front line sometimes as combatants and often as innocent bystanders swept up by conflict who lose their lives in a way that is completely unacceptable. It was always acceptable, but it's utterly unacceptable in the 21st century. And of course, often trade union members find themselves fighting on both sides in a conflict. So it's really important that the trade union movement seeks to pursue the question of the abolition of war. Because, of course, globally, we are the biggest civil society organization with equality, peace, and social justice as core principles of why it is that we seek to organize workers and we seek to influence society. And our speaker today is a man who holds those principles absolutely dearly. Philip Jennings is the General Secretary of Uni Global, which brings together millions of workers, 20 million of them, across 900 unions, principally of workers from the services and skills sectors. And as we all know, the way things are going in our economies at the moment, services and skills are the areas in which very many of our new jobs will be created. So Philip is in a growth area of the trade union movement, and we're very pleased about that. Philip is a powerful and lively speaker. You will hear him in person today, but if you don't get enough today, just go home and Google him and look at all the brilliant speeches he's made on YouTube. I've particularly enjoyed his destruction of Walmart, which is an absolutely hideous company exploiting all those who work for it. So his task today is to inform and to provoke questions which we will take at the end of his remarks, about peace and freedom, about why, as I said, we in the trade union movement want to contribute to it and how we can contribute to the achievement of the abolition of war. We are delighted that Philip, who hails from Cardiff but now lives in Geneva, has been able to join us from Geneva, and just to show how very lucky we are and what elevated circles in which Philip generally moves. We have the joy of having him here to speak to us today, but he is soon to meet with about 100 other key leaders of the trade union movement globally, with the Pope. So I'm sure that the fact that he's accepted to come and talk with us today is an indication of just how seriously he thinks that we should take the question of the abolition of war. Philip, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for those wonderful words of welcome. I come in peace, but not as far as Walmart and Uber are concerned. As far as I'm concerned, they are still on the other side. I know Bruce Kent is with us, so any tips that you've got for the combined union movement on what we should be saying to the Pope in a couple of weeks' time, I would be more than grateful. I'm feeling a little bit edgy, however, but because he wanted, obviously, to make me feel relaxed at this podium on this particular day, and he started telling me the story of a speaker at a cremation who started delivering the eulogy, and his trousers started falling down without the speaker being aware. And Bruce didn't want to interrupt the flow, and he didn't tell him either. Needless to say, no one has forgotten that particular eulogy. However, Clark, I think you should have called yourself Clark Kent. It's much better. Yeah, so, you know, if there's a few, could you please send me a distress signal just in case? I'm here as a General Secretary of a global union. We have members in over 150 countries. The theme to today is freedom from fear, unions for peace. At the annual TUC Congress, which is the gathering of all the British trade unions, it's the Parliament of Labour in this country, they meet in September. The first act of business is to stand in silence for those brothers and sisters who have been lost, but also to stand in communion, if you like, for world peace. In a fractured world where we see threats to world peace all around us, a 20th century where 187 million people lost their lives, where the civilian death count is on the rise. In Syria, 90% of the casualties have been civilian. On this Sunday, when we remember the fallen, both soldier and civilian, in the tradition of the TUC, can we just stand just for 1 minute and have some private thoughts about the necessity for world peace? Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I am here because the youth committee of the group were with me in Berlin. I spoke at the closing ceremony of a peace conference, and I never imagined that just a few short months afterwards I would find myself speaking here today. It had been a rather dry affair, I must say. It wasn't the most thrilling of conferences, but the vice president here, also from Wales, from magnificent Ystrad Mynach, started the process of getting me here to speak today. So it is a great honor, a great privilege, and it certainly is a first. My time is spent out there in the muck and the bullets, dare I say, of dealing with the casualties of human rights abuses and trade union rights abuses. And I'd like to remember all of those people on this special day, both those who've fallen in combat and the people, the civilians. My great-grandfather died 1 week after the end of the First World War, and we will be at his graveside next year in Orléans on the centenary of his death. We still don't know the reasons why he died. It was just from the injuries that he had picked up during combat. And then you begin to think about how war has touched all of our lives. And if you go to the headquarters of the TUC, how many of you have been to the headquarters of the TUC? You're all very, very welcome. If you go into the courtyard of the TUC, there's this wonderful sculpture, a Pieta, by Jacob Epstein. And he carved from a 10-ton rock a woman holding in her arms a fallen soldier, i.e., a woman holding a fallen soldier. We're not sure if it's a child, soldier, but what I'm saying is, from every window in that house, you can see that Epstein, the General Secretary of the TUC. Every single day that Frances O'Grady is in that office, she looks directly at this sculpture. Every trade union leader sees this sculpture. It's a daily reminder of the constancy of our effort to build a world of peace. Yes, it remembers the fallen union members that lost their lives in battle that Christine referred to. But at the same time, it's a point of remembrance. It's a point of reference. And I understand that when this statue was unveiled, the Horse Guards, whoever they are, the buglers of the Horse Guards Parade, all had to join the Musicians Union, if only for 1 hour, so that they could perform the ritual. In my case, when we look at, you think I'm 64 years old, born in 1953. My mother tells me there was rationing. And then you ask the question, how did war touch lives? And how did war touch family lives, even when you're too young to know it, to understand it, or to feel it? In Cardiff, 2,100 bombs fell on the city from 1941 until 1944. 355 people lost their lives. One of those 2,100 bombs, there may well have been others, did not explode. My mother was 9 years old. She'd gone to the cinema, courageous. She was in a cinema watching Night Train to Munich. A bomb came through the roof. It landed in the row behind my mother. It did not explode. It did not explode. She rushed out of the cinema, rushed back home, got into the Anderson shelter, and then got the most severe telling off from her auntie whose care she was in. My mother is obviously very persuasive, but I think you would agree with me that she's also very lucky. 20 years later, I was 9 years old, a 9-year-old child walking hand in hand with my mother to school. It was a rough neighborhood. At 9 years old, you had to hold the hand of your mother. And then I looked at the sky. I'll never forget it. It was a clear blue sky. Term had started, and in the sky was this jet with the jet stream behind it. And I asked my mother, I said, "Is that a missile, Mum?" And she gave me a clip and said, "No, keep your eyes on the road or you will be run over." A mother with feet on the ground. But even at that age, with the Cuban Missile Crisis dominating the news, a 9-year-old child wondering if this was the end or the beginning of the end. And then 55 years on, my 9-year-old granddaughter witnesses Donald Trump on the television talking about fire and fury. And then she looks at me and says, "Grampy, can you do something?" 3 moments where conflict touched the lives of just one family. And here we are, 56 years on from the bomb that almost took my mother's life to the doomsday clock that now stands at 3 minutes to midnight. Today on the journey across London and at Paddington, we see the veterans, the soldiers, their families, proud, reflective, a day to remember, colleagues lost, comrades, times gone, times to reconnect, and always asking themselves the question, where are we today? I fought for something. Where are we today? Yesterday in Warsaw, 60,000 people attended an Independence Day rally. You may have seen the pictures. It was organized by the nationalist youth movement that seeks an ethnically pure Poland. The banners read, "White Europe." The banners read, "Clean blood." The banners read, "Holocaust for Muslims." The organizers present themselves as an heir to the 1930 fascist movement. A counter-protester said, "We live in fear." I was with Lech Wałęsa in the late 1980s. We worked with the Solidarność movement to make a new future for that country. Democratic, open, free, justice, a parliament. We sat together to build a new Europe. I was 36-year-old. I'd only been in the job as General Secretary just a couple of months. Europe opened. I was there last Friday talking to young people, and they said our dreams have not been fulfilled. They were of the left. They are socialists. They are unionists. What happened? They said, we are abused at work in a way that you would not understand or appreciate. And they said, this is feeling anger and resentment. Why should a young worker have to spend 60 hours a week at work? A crane driver working 300 hours a month with a broken body by the time they are 40 years old. In Germany, the AfD, extreme right, now has 92 seats in the German parliament, people. They won 32% of the vote. It's the first time that we've seen the presence in that number in the German parliament since the end of the war. In Austria, the far right has won 52 seats in a recent election. And everywhere in Europe, the right, the populist right, the racist right is on the rise. The warning signs are everywhere. The warning signs are everywhere. It is 3 minutes to midnight. We see, from where I am, I have to spend a lot of time moving around the planet. We see a fractured world. We are aware of 1 billion people who are living in zones of conflict or in what we call fragile states. 100 million people have sought humanitarian aid in the course of the last 2 years. That's a threefold increase during the last 15 years. We already had economic, social, political, and climate fault lines. We have 65 million people displaced. We feel the disorder. We have a world where we feel it's in crisis management. We see go it alone. We see provocative talk between the mighty powers. We hear language that almost makes use of nuclear weapons in the sense of why not? We see ethnic cleansing. We see interstate war and proxy wars, ignorance of and avoidance of institutions to settle conflict. On top of that, the new digital cyber warfare, information warfare, and so forth. And in this sea of troubles, we see the rise of terrorist acts in our cities, harming the innocent, taking the lives of the innocent, and making us fearful and fragile. So in this world of disorder, it feels almost like a permanent crisis. To talk of peace and peaceful resolution almost feels naive, futile, and out of touch. As far as my movement is concerned, as far as the labor movement is concerned, this is the time to take a stand and to fight back. We cannot remain silent in the face of what we are seeing. My talk today is about freedom from fear, unions for peace. But I would also say in preparing these remarks, which I found tremendously challenging and demanding, it is also a time for our labor movement and for the peace movement to join together and to link and to fight the intolerance and the rise of the xenophobic right that we see today. I represent unions in 150 countries, but we're part of a broader global union movement. We represent 200 million people, and the people that we negotiate for probably stretch close to 1 billion people whose lives, the quality of their lives, depend on our negotiating skills. We are part of a global union movement, and a global movement that has so much in common with you and the organizers here today. I attended the last day of the People Power exhibition here. Did anybody else manage to see it during the course of the year? A really excellent opportunity. I never felt you would see something in the Imperial War Museum. And it shows a century of activism for peace, a century of activism with a constant for the demand for universal peace. People being derided, imprisoned, ridiculed for standing up for this dream, this vision of a universal peace. People, civil society, unions mobilizing and sharing the vision of a world of bread, peace, freedom, justice, equality, standing against discrimination in all its forms. We have so much in common. We question the structure of political power. We reject the economic violence against our people. We reject the haters, the xenophobes, the fascists and the racists, the wall bidders. We share the love of our planet. We reject the violence against women and reject them being used as instruments of war. We cry out for justice for refugees and migrant workers and aim to defeat the human traffickers. We say refugees welcome, and we say embrace your migrant brother and sister. We share the call for a world free of nuclear weapons, and we rejoice that ICANN has won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I look forward to being there on December the 11th when that prize is given to ICANN. Let's have a round of applause for ICANN. So we say together that another world is possible. We say that there is an alternative vision of hope and peace. Not for you or for us is it a time to remain quiet. As Martin Luther King said, there comes a time when silence is betrayal. We will not betray the people. We together share so much, and we must not give up, as the doomsday clock reminds us of the urgency of now. In my talk, I will relate how we work as a union movement to free the world from fear, and how each day in our daily work, we work for peace, our struggle for peace, and how we resist. It is who we are. We have always been in the front lines for peace, democracy, and human rights. We strive for decent work, for freedom to people to organize, to negotiate, to have a decent home, a decent school, decent healthcare, to have equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, equality in mobility. We campaign to stop violence against women. We work across ethnic communities. Peace, equality, and democracy. In a fractured world, those are our pillars, our pathway to peace and security. We say no justice, no peace. We say no peace, no justice. And when we see peace and justice working together, when you look at those nations where the level of union density is the highest, what results do we see? Unthinkable that they would ever go to war, one nation against another. They are the happiest nations. They are the most peaceful nations. They are the most social nations. They are the most innovative nations. They are the most competitive nations. And they have a union movement at their heart, which is strong and vigorous. Friends, next year in 2018, the TUC will celebrate its 150th anniversary. Now, that's surely worth a round of applause. What's the ticket? Their first Congress took place in Manchester in 1868. It'll be a time to look forward, but really we want to examine our roots and the messages and the lessons learned, but essentially it will be a very positive and strong message to send to the British public. It'll be a time to look at the contribution that unions have made to peace and during wartime. The work that we have done to bring democracy, decent work, and social justice to the British people. It's a story of struggle. Nothing was ever given to us. When we first organized, we were considered a criminal conspiracy against the interests of the powerful. We've had to fight unfair laws since then. Tough employers facing consequences, sometimes bloody repression, sometimes exile, but always passionate about the people that we represent and the mission that we have. International trade unionism can also trace its roots back to 200 years. But it really came alive in the turn of the 20th century. At the time of, say, in that decade before the First World War. And I'm not a historian. I think in my retirement, I will become a labor historian. Because the closer you look, the more fascinating our story becomes. And to look at those connections that took place at that time, before the First World War, is really fascinating. And I would recommend that you read two of the Nobel Peace Prize. Two union leaders won peace prizes. In 1934, Arthur Henderson, and in 1951, Léon Jouhar. Both of them union leaders winning peace prizes, and I know that Henderson in particular was involved in the peace process after the Versailles Treaty. What you have is, all I can do is give you some episodes, some headlines from that time to give you a sense of what was going on. In 1910 in Copenhagen, Socialist International Keir Hardie says, the Congress recognised the efficacy of a general strike against war, particularly in the arms industry. The CGT of France in 1914 said, the workers must respond to the declaration of war by a declaration of a general strike. Not just a general strike, but a revolutionary general strike. In 1911, the labour federations in France said, all declarations of war, the workers without delay must respond with a general strike. The TUC here still has in its constitution, 8K, that there will be a Congress called when war is declared. Samuel Gompers, an American union leader at that time, on a visit to France, called for an international conference of workers and unions to build fraternal relations, to protect workers' interests, to build a desirable peace. And the unions called for compulsory arbitration in the case of state-to-state conflict. In Leeds, I know the historians here may know of the Leeds Soviet, as it was then called. An international union conference took place, and they declared an international policy of workers' rights, union rights, defending migrant workers and for social insurance. And they passed a motion to create the International Labour Office. In 1917, the unions came together and said, we need a global institution to settle our differences. Well, we know all the calls, dashed by the call to arms, to flag, to country, to king, to Kaiser, to nation. But unions were working with a vision for peace when war ended. And perhaps on the minds of many at that time is a quote from Eugene Debs, the US trade union leader, when he said, capitalist wars for capitalist conquest and capitalist plunder must be fought by the capitalists themselves, so far as I am concerned. And upon that question, there can be no misunderstanding as to my position. I would not violate my principles for God, much less for a crazy Kaiser, a savage Tsar, a degenerate king, or a band of pot-bellied parasites. He went to prison for 5 years for these words. So, the Versailles Treaty came, the roots of the Second World War were sown, but at that time, the message of working people was heard. The working people, the unions across those different countries. Jean Jaurès, the French socialist, assassinated on the eve of the First World War because of his call for a general strike. Messages being sent from the French trade union, Léon Jouhar, to the German trade union leader saying, we will not take up arms against one another. We are brothers. The message was intercepted. It never got through. The product came, and that was the creation of the International Labour Office. They celebrate their centenary in 1919. The committee that drew up the constitution of the ILO was a trade union official. And today I'm very proud to say that a UK trade unionist, Guy Ryder, a former official of the TUC, is the Director General. He is the boss of the ILO, and he's from Liverpool and its rich labour tradition, but he's guiding that place through its centenary. And this organisation is important to all of us. It is the only place, really, where workers have a seat at the table. It is a place where is built on the ravages of war, the deaths that family members, that workers and their families have suffered. And the whole ethos of that building is to build labour standards in place to be able to associate and to negotiate. And that brings peace. And they say injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that universal and lasting peace must be based on social justice. And that's where the labour movement comes in, our mission for peace. That universal and lasting peace must be based on social justice. And they also said that labour is not a commodity. And that is a contemporary problem that we have today. Just as an aside, when Uber and others claim that that driver is not in an employment relationship, he is treating that worker as a commodity and not as a human being, people. And therefore, So in those post-war years, unions were active in the Versailles Treaty, building the ILO, calling for new means to resolve international state-to-state conflict, to diminish the instruments of war and to end the legality of war as considered. And in my reading, I plead my ignorance. I came across a wonderful book called The Internationalists by Hathaway and Shapiro. I recommend it to everybody. And it tells the story of a peace treaty. And at 3:57 p.m. in Paris, on August the 27th, 1928, war was declared illegal. I was unaware of this. How many people in the room? I'm ignorant. Yeah, all those. This is the roots of your movement, must be. So there I am, all these years on, banging on, and then discovering this reality that 63 nations, France and Germany, signed a paper that said that war is outlawed. 63 ratifications. That's extraordinary. We know that the pact failed to end war. Indeed, there was soon all-out war. And what did people say about this pact? Henry Kissinger said, "Irresistible as it is meaningless." Thank you, Henry. Others called it childish, a laughing stock, and the international equivalent of an air kiss. It may not have brought world peace, but the authors, Hathaway and Shapiro, make the point and make a convincing case that that was a turning point in history. And so all the members of this organization who sponsored this today take encouragement from the words contemporary writers are saying, that the work that you have done, the work that this organization done, changed the course of history. It may have not been the there and the then, but it changed things. It changed the glorification of war. It changed the perceptions that you don't settle state-to-state difference by all-out war. Let's give this movement a round of applause whilst I have a drink. They called it, because in the normal discourse, a movement against war, yes, but when you begin to say that nations came together and agreed a treaty of this nature, and is now being proven to be transformational, a transformational event in human history, that they made the world more peaceful. And I would like to suggest to the Imperial War Museum that next year they make a stand here, or a department upstairs, where they look at this decision to abolish war, and how the course of war, the nature of war, has changed in the context of this peace pact. Today, war is considered a departure from civilized politics. And it marked the end of a time where the reflex was you settle conflicts by state to state. You settle differences by going to war. Has changed. It's been an end to the glorification of war. I know at a time where there are 23 major conflicts taking place in the world, which lost 157,000 lives last year, and all the other fault lines to which I have been referring, you may think that perhaps this is still in, as the commentator said, an air kiss to history. But I ask you to look. I ask you to look at the work of Erica Chenoweth. She's a professor out at Denver University. She has studied every single social movement since 1900. If more than 1,000 people are involved, she studied it. And guess what conclusion she has come to? Non-violence works. Non-violence works. I met her last week. And she said, do you know, Philip, if you get 3.5% of the population of a country behind an issue, you can change the direction of a nation. And she said in the United States of America, that's just 11 million people. And I also said, what about us as a labor movement? We're being condemned and marginalized. She said, Philip, you're an institution which is powerful and resonates. You're going to be fine. but you have to mobilise. But she also said something very interesting. She said, Philip, when you're talking to people about peace, can you make sure that in all those peace processes, that Philip, when you're in a peace process, make sure that one of your team leaders is a woman. She said that if a woman is in the leadership team of a peace process, there's a 35% better chance, I may have the stats wrong, that peace will lead to a peaceful resolution. So these figures are powerful. 3.5% of a population, and including women in the peace process. Israeli women and Palestinian women negotiating together. I think there's a chance. So when you look at us, we believe in this culture of peace. And we see things often in black and white, but the work that we do is, we're like bricklayers. We're building bricks. We're laying bricks. We want a positive peace. You know, negative peace doesn't work. When you have a winner and loser and the winner sets the terms, that's how we feel as a labor movement. It does not bring peace, it brings resentment and anger. But we want a positive peace where action can prevent or mitigate conflict through institutions, the United Nations, negotiations, peace processes, agreements, and about redistribution of resources and education, and declarations of human rights next year, the 70th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. Our work is for a positive peace over the long term, which is sustainable and brings social justice, which takes us beyond just the absence of violence. And I just cast an eye over my career on the things that I've been involved with in trying to create this culture of peace. I talked about Poland, where we were active. I remember being in Chile and Argentina. 30,000 Argentinians disappeared. 3,000 Chileans disappeared. Brazilians living in a dictatorship. We were in South Africa, where the trade union movement was active to bring freedom to the country. We were in Tunisia, in Colombia, Chile, as I've mentioned, Indonesia, Philippines, Nepal, and many, many, many other places. And at the end of the day, we never consider ourselves as peacemakers. We think we're dealing with social problems. We're getting people out of prison, trying to put the finger in the eye of an employer or a minister about the mistreatment of workers. But what we should understand is that what we're doing is building peace and executing peaceful means to resolve issues. Our work is about building bridges to peace, to develop that culture of peace, and the tensions, amidst all the tensions and the chaos of today. And we have many strands to our work, but I have to check, how am I doing for time? I never look at my watch.
40 minutes.
I've spoken for 40 minutes. 35. How is everybody? Are you with me still? I'm not talking too fast? Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm now going to rattle through the remaining 2/3 of my speech. Okay, I want to get a very clear message to you. We reject the economic violence against people. We don't use these terms normally. We see economic violence against people. In the world's labor force, 3.2 billion people at work. 50% of them don't have a proper job. No contract. They don't know when the money is going to come next. 1 billion surviving on $2 a day. 450 million in supply chains, 9 out of 10 of whom have no proper contract. The share of wages in the wealth produced one day was close to 75%, i.e. when you looked at the wealth of a nation, it was close to 75%. It's gone down to 50%. It's gone down to 50%. The wage performance in this country hasn't been this bad for 200 years. And that's with the TUC busting a gut to draw attention to this. In the United States, no pay rise for 40 years. 1 in 8 people struggle to put food on the table. 1 in 10 people in Europe living in poverty. 8 people with half the wealth of the world. Now, people aren't stupid. People feel this and see this, and it builds resentment. We do our global surveys. 3/4 of the world are worried about losing their jobs. Over half do not expect the next generation to find a decent job. 45% have said income has fallen behind the cost of living and that the minimum wage is insufficient to lead a decent life. 85% of the people that we survey say, you've got to change the rules of the game. And 93% say, take a stand against corporate abuse. That's why in this country, with the Labour Party policy of the many and, for the many, not the few, does resonate with people. Because we understand that the whole economic orientation of our countries is for the few and not the many. And we can see this resentment wherever I go. The people are saying it's not working for us, Philip. And this anxiety and anger and insecurity and precarity is preyed upon by the extreme right. They blame others. They blame the neighbor. They blame people of color, the refugee, the migrant worker, sowing hate and discord. Social inclusion also means that young people fall prey to and are attracted to the extremists and terror groups. I'm very often in Africa. Only 5% of the African population has a job. In the next 10 years, the African population will treble to 1.2 billion. There will be 500 million young people. 500 million young people with an awareness of the world. We have the biggest jobs challenge facing us, but it's a challenge that we have to meet. And then there's another fact that comes across through all of this anger and resentment. A greater share of young people in democracies in Australia, Canada, Germany, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the USA claim democracy is a bad way to run a country. I was astonished when I came across that. Then we see the political violence against us. The political violence against against us as union leaders and members to strangle our voice and to legalize us out of business. We surveyed 139 countries. 84 countries exclude groups of workers from labor law. 3/4 of countries deny some or all workers the right to strike. 3/4 deny workers the right to collectively bargain. And 50 deny freedom of speech and assembly. This is a grim panorama for us, but we plow on, we move on, and we remind the governments that do things like this, that on the second day that Hitler was in office, on May the 2nd, 1933, the first thing he did was to demolish the trade union movement, dismiss everybody, close their offices. We used to have an office in Amsterdam during the occupation. The whole place was ransacked. We lost every single record that we had, accumulated over 50 years. What we're saying to the world is, to those union bashers and haters and the Walmarts, that when you weaken us, you weaken our voice, you weaken democracy. We go to places which are not almost the most comfortable. In Colombia, I've been there many times. They now have a peace agreement. The process towards that peace agreement was to work with the trade union movement. I've been to Colombia many times, and I've had in my arms the mother and the father and the family of a 32-year-old son that was murdered by paramilitaries because he was a union leader. Murdered. They will never have another happy day in their life. And there were 3,200 people like him. But they had the courage, those people, to stay with their union movement, to take a stand for peace. In Tunisia, the Jasmine Revolution was failing. And then the unions came together with lawyers and human rights lawyers and employers, and we worked together, and they came up with a solution for the country, a new constitution, which was negotiated with the trade union movement. In South Korea, a corrupt regime, 2 million workers went into the streets with their candles. We had a candlelight vigil, and it resulted in the end of that government. And even so, the union leader that led that process still languishes in prison. We are active in Palestine, and we are vocal about the need for an independent and democratic state of Palestine. We work with the Palestine unions. You have to go there to see it. If you have the opportunity to go there and to visit the illegal settlements and also to visit the occupied territories, you will know what I mean. We will not give up in the hope that one day Palestine will be free. And when you talk to a young man in a refugee camp, as I did just a few weeks ago, I said, what keeps you strong? He said, Philip, what keeps me strong is I know that one day this land will be mine. We are active in other fields, and I don't have the time to go into this now. We are active with the peace movement. We're active with social movements. We also would like a much more robust conversation about conversion and diversification to take place in the world. We have a job shortage in this world. We have massive possibilities for employment growth even in the face of the digital revolution. We need to have a much broader conversation about what diversification means, what conversion means at a time when the world is spending $1.7 trillion on arms. We are worried about artificial intelligence and robotic war, and we are taking a petition to the United Nations to ban it and to have an ethical code with respect to the artificial intelligence that we see. Finally, in 2010, I took 2,000 trade unionists to Nagasaki. Again, when you live it and see it, it changes who you are and how you see the world. I'd been to Hiroshima, I'd been to Nagasaki. We took 2,000 people there. They met the habakusha, they met with the school children, they met with the families, and it changed people's views and minds. And we are, as an organization, committed to ICANN, of course. We're committed to a world free of weapons of mass destruction and a world free of nuclear weapons. We also see our responsibility to support the COP21 talks. We were there. It is without doubt the challenge of our time to lead a sustainable revolution at a time when 9 million people lost their lives because of deterioration of our climate. But to do all of these things, can I just throw in, we also need to see tax justice as well. We saw this week the Paradise Papers revealed once again the depths of the tax avoiders will go to avoid contributing to society in order to build and hive their share of wealth. It is shameful, and in a world that is overarmed and peace underfunded, simply not acceptable. I want to say to you that we are fighting back in conclusion, that we do have another agenda for the world which will inspire and which we will be determined to see through. It's an alternative that we call people-centered growth. It can be done. It's more successful than the neoliberal model that we have seen. We will be leading an assault on inequality. We do have sustainable development goals, which may be familiar to you. 17 goals, 169 objectives, one of which is to eliminate extreme poverty by the year 2030, can be done. To eliminate child labor. When I started this work, there were nearly 300 million children at work. Now it's at 158 million. We've got to reduce that to zero in the next 7 years. Climate change, I've mentioned. A global law which ensures that business follows human rights. To develop a culture of peace and to continue our work against and to ban weapons of mass destruction. We have a social summit next week in Europe. This Brexit story is dreadful. It's a dreadful story because all the things that you do, the European Union was about abolishing war in Europe. The European Union was about bringing people together that there would never be the same level of conflict. I wasn't in the country at the time, but I'm not sure how strong this message came across and whether this connected with people sufficiently that this is, above all, a peace agreement for Europe and its future generations. I could go on, as you can see. I think it's time for me to close my remarks and to thank you for giving me this opportunity. It is an opportunity which I've relished, but I found extremely demanding because one has to go deep into oneself and ask the question, well, what is the contribution that you are making to peace? We don't live in peaceful times, but what is the contribution that we as an organization are making to peace? And I think as a result of this and the Congress in Berlin, I'm going to wake up the labor movement to take this issue of peace in the broadest sense much more seriously. To move away, yes, we need to be strong on trade and trade justice and supply chains, but we need to have more on peace. We have to put peace central to our conversations and to our speeches. We have to get across to the leaders that we meet in the G20 that you're leaving so many people behind, that you're making your communities and societies fragile. Paul Jo Cox, a Labour MP, was a passionate defender of the European Union and immigration, was murdered for her beliefs. And also, with the words that I've shared with you, with her in mind, I think we should share the words of Martin Luther King when he said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." And then with a sense of determination, I'm a Welshman, I'll use the words of Dylan Thomas, it's a different context, that we will rage against the dying of that peaceful light. Thank you, everybody.
Colleagues and comrades, friends, on your behalf, I just want to say such a big thank you to Philip. He's clearly an absolutely inspirational speaker. And as I got to the bottom of the stairs, I said, "That was brilliant." He said, "Was it all right?" I mean, I think it was so much better than all right. I've barely got the words for it. It was fantastic. Okay. But I'm sure that you're prepared to take a few questions, Philip, before I do my final thank you. Okay, I don't think we've got a roving mic, so colleagues are going to have to... Oh, we do. Excellent. Okay. Right, so Sally's going to do the roving mic. Should we take a couple?
Carry on.
You organise the questions. I'll just go down and...
Ladies, there we are. Lady in the front row. Did I speak too fast? You were worried that I was going to speak too fast.
No, it's
right.
Absolutely perfect.
Okay.
I mean, I can't speak for Bruce, but absolutely perfect for me. But I think my question is more to do with the ideology of neoliberalism is obviously quite practiced to quite an extent in this country. As a person with a disability, I receive something called personal independence payment, which is now going to be transferred to a system called universal credit, which is already driving people to extremes of poverty, not seen since the Victorian era. And over 100,000 people have died since 2010 when the Conservative government took over. Disabled people. I suppose what I'm sort of like asking you is, you talk about the rise of fascism in various countries in Europe, and the signs of, Holocaust for Muslims. And there's been a Holocaust throughout history. It isn't just the Holocaust of the 1930s, which is the most recent one, the most prevalent one, but there's been so many, times when humanity has kind of just been very kind of neoliberal and social Darwinism has permeated. And then we've got ourselves and the sort of the labour movement and the, we're fighting for social justice. I think my question is it a futile struggle? Is it something that we'll ever win?
Okay. Do you want to take them groups or one by one? Take three. All right. That chap there with a rather splendid beard for Christmas.
Thank you, Philip. Passionate, utterly convincing, and of course I agree with every word. And now comes the but.
Yeah.
You touched momentarily on conversion and diversification.
Yes.
But it seems to me, as a lifelong peace campaigner and a lifelong trade unionist, that the trade unions in the UK are amongst the biggest obstacles that we have.
Yes.
My own trade union, Prospect, Science and Technologists, is dominated by people in the defence industry.
Yeah.
The engineering unions, the biggest unions in the country, will not talk disarmament, will not talk banning arms sales because of their jobs. Now can you, in your position, or can you make a recommendation to others, how can we get the leaders of the trade union movement to come on board to create a change in attitude?
Okay, number 3, there was... Hang on, I'll go this side. We've had 2 from this side, we'll take 1 from this side. Whoever wants the mic.
Frank Jackson. The previous speaker has almost preempted what I was going to say. In 1945, I was an aircraft apprentice helping to build torpedo bombers for the war in the Pacific. And of course, subsequently, I did see the diversification taking place. And so to supplement what gentleman over there said, what happened to change that situation from 1945 onwards when the trade union movement and everybody else was engaged in conversion to joyfully engage in conversion to peace industry to the situation which our friend there has just described?
Okay. Hope dies last. It's a famous book by Studs Terkel, the Chicago commentator, and I had the... I met Ahmed Kathrada. He was a Rivonia trialist, and he was imprisoned with Nelson Mandela on Robben Island for those 18 years and won his freedom I think it was 6 or 7 years afterwards. And we asked him, did you ever give up hope? And he said, never. Never. And he came to speak at our Congress, and he stood there in all his modesty and majesty, and he said, when I stand before all of you, mainly young people, he said it felt like this struggle was worthwhile. You must never lose hope, and you must never give up. And you must mobilize. And you must mobilize because this government, I'm not here, I don't see the constant to and fro of the political punch up here. But it's clear something is. When I go back home to my town, it's Llanrumney in Cardiff. My mother's there. She's 84, as I said. And when I go up to the top shops, it's a working class area, and I see people. And honestly, I can see they don't look well. It's not. I know I live in Switzerland. It's another world. And I go back to Mam, and I say, Mam, there's something wrong. I said, the busiest shop up there is Iceland. What's wrong? She said, Philip, people are struggling. It reminded me of the time when I went into Central and Eastern Europe for the first time in the late 80s. So you must never give up. 100,000 people have died. This is a national crime. You must never give up. You promise you're not going to give up? It's never futile. It is never futile. Look at those people in history who have been through these trials and these difficulties and these struggles. And eventually, you win. Like Andy said, first of all, they laugh at you, then they ignore you, and then you win. And we have these wins in our work. Defense diversification, I think it has to take place in a new context now. I mean, I must say, it hasn't dominated conversations in my organization, to be fair. I've seen the various policy statements that have been made, and there's clearly a defense first being taken. But I struggle. I tell you why I struggle. Because of the futility of nuclear war in one hand, and secondly, the potential that we have today with the future world of work. And I encourage every trade union leader, and I think the TUC have called for a national commission in respect to this, in what kind of context do you have a conversation about the future world of work? And sometimes the context matters. And when you look at the distribution of where employment is in say, manufacturing, which at one day was 30% of the workforce, and today is probably down to 12%. And then you look at the number of people in manufacturing, defense-related, Is this a smart choice for the country to have so many eggs in one basket? I think we can be relatively clear there's a pretty firm market for military arms and military expenditure. But my advice would be put it in the context of the future world of work, because the figures that are being shown to us are quite dramatic, that 1 in 2 jobs could be lost, that 30% of the skills that we have today will be lost. And then you have to ask the question, well, do we want an algorithmic robot to be able to have sort of responsibility for all of this? So what my advice would be is that to engage the union leaders and to engage the workers in the industry also about what does the future world of work look like. It's not the answer that you're probably looking for, but nevertheless, it's a debate that should take place. And I noticed the TUC have said that I couldn't understand why the Labour government, last one, got rid of the Defence Diversification Unit. I mean, I just thought it made common sense to look at where new possibilities outside of the arms industry could take place. We know there's a need for care. We know there's a need for the greening of the economy. We know the shameful state of infrastructure could provide jobs, and others too, as this digital revolution takes place. Not satisfied, I know, but that's my piece. That's my piece. Man with the mic.
My name is Peter.
Hello, Peter.
Thank you very much for a tremendously inspiring talk.
Thank you.
The sentiments should be applauded by everybody. But I have one critical remark to make to you.
Mm-hmm.
I wish you had not invoked Samuel Gompers of the AFL in the United States.
Yeah.
Samuel Gomper and the AFL in the United States were responsible for mobilizing repression against a fantastic labor organization, the Industrial Workers of the World.
Yes.
The Industrial Workers of the World wanted one big union.
Yes.
And we should support that notion of one big union.
Yes.
And not go around invoking Samuel Gompers.
Okay. Well, I did quote Eugene Debs, and he was a founder of the IWW, the Wobblies. And at the time, it is a historical fact that he was the chairman of the committee that wrote the rules for the International Labour Office. He was a union man, and he wrote the rules of the ILO, and I drew the parallel with the fact that today we have a union man that is the Director General of the ILO. He did it. It's an historical fact. So I tried to balance it with quoting the words of Mr. Eugene Debs. Thank you. Right.
While you were talking, I had a bright idea. And the bright idea is my hero, Ron Todd.
Ah.
Now, you must know Ron Todd.
Yes, yes.
Ron Todd was fantastic as a trade unionist and a peace worker.
Yes.
He wore his shoes out walking to Aldermaston and Bergfield, God knows. How about a trade union and peace movement annual prize, like the Nobel Prize, the Ron Todd Prize? I think that would help to change opinion a bit in this country.
I think that's a wonderful idea. I think this idea, this notion of peace becoming much more part of our conversation as a movement is important. We have seen over the ages a number of Nobel Peace Prize winners. The ILO won the prize in '69, Léon Jouhar 51, Arthur Henderson 1934, Lech Wałęsa 1983, the Tunisians. I think, this is mischief making, but if someone was to nominate the global trade union movement for the Nobel Peace Prize, that would really sort things out. i.e., if you're going to win it, you've got to deserve it. And if you're going to win it, you've got to do it. And if you're going to do it, you've got to prove it. So this idea of a peace prize in that regard, I think could be really inspiring, because it's not a conversation that we are having. I can assure you, when I'm in Colombia, yes. When I'm in Argentina, yes. But in Europe, it's been lost. This Brexit story, we should be talking more about the dangers. With 60,000 young, well, I'm not sure they're all fascists, but say 59,000 of them were. This Peace Prize would be a very good idea. And yes, Ron Todd was an outstanding man, a good man. And I'm happy to say I'm a guest in my house. Are we?
Okay.
We're done, are we?
I think there might be one or two other people who did have questions, but I must say, I think we've kept Philip at the rostrum for a very long time, and given that he feared that he might even lose his voice when we were having lunch, I think he's done a remarkable job. I just want to conclude by saying that if there is anyone here who isn't actually a member, then there's a leaflet outside for you to join and sign up. One of the very few things that Philip didn't invoke was the question that, yes, of course, in the trade union movement, we need bread, but we need roses. Yeah. And roses will never flourish where we have conflict. Yeah. So we have to have the absence of conflict and, as you said, positive peace so that we can all, the trade union movement and all of us, genuinely have bread and roses. Philip, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Okay.